Hi, everybody. This is Tom Salemi of Device Talks. I'm here at 160 Studios with the CEO of the Mullings Group, Joe Mullings. Joe, thank you for having me here.
Thanks for coming down.
I feel like I'm cooking a meal for you in your own kitchen. Like,
kind of is.
Joe.
I like co-chefing with you.
Yeah, just like, Joe, where's the steak knives? This is fantastic. You got all the latest equipment. It's an impressive setup, honestly, all joking aside. So it's great to visit with you. You're going to be at Device Talks Boston May 10th and 11th. We're excited to have you there. You're going to be in the closing session with me and Chris Newmarker, sort of breaking down what transpired over the last 2 days, but also I think we'll take a broader look at what's going on in the industry, which is kind of the part I also want to unpack here today.
Cool.
So let's just talk, let's get right to it. I mean, we've been anticipating, we've been watching layoffs and realignments of workforces or whatever euphemism you want to use to describe layoffs. We were anticipating the big one, Medtronic, and that news came out last week. Are we at the bottom of this cycle? Do you get a sense? Are things going to start turning up again? What's your assessment of what's transpired over the last 3 or 4 months, and what do you think is going to happen over the next month or two? Where are we?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, the headlines, obviously, I think your organization does a great job of tracking these, and I think the number's up to 120,000 sort of rift people in the health tech, med tech industry over the last year or so. You know, if you roll in Philips and Medtronic and J&J and all that, which, you know, I think is unprecedented in our industry. Although we've never tracked it before, this feels like the biggest adjustment of all time in my 32 years. And what is that from? Well, you know, I think it's a convergence of a number of things. I think what happened during COVID is still feeling a little backlash, meaning we had down sales in general across the board because hospitals were kind of shut down. So any of those surgeries, even if they were not elective surgeries, were put on hold. So that hurt a little bit. I also think that the work from anywhere or the work from none of your own business sort of caught up as well. Although, you know, executives in the larger organizations were a lot more tolerant of it, but I think the experiment failed. I certainly think that efficiencies and output went down dramatically in a lot of areas. We make things, Tom. We make things. We fabricate life-saving, life-extending things. You have to be together with your team. Sure, are there some functions that we found out can be somewhat remote for the most part? Yeah, they can be. But for the most part, we have to be all together. And so I think we had efficiencies and output drop dramatically. I also think that there was a reckoning on some very large programs, in particular on the digital and robotics side, in 2 of the big players, the 2 big strategics, J&J and Medtronic. And those didn't end up going as well as everybody had hoped for. And it sort of reared its head, so to speak, Q3, Q4, and certainly into the first half or the first quarter of 2023. And I think if you look at those downsizing, for the most part, a lot of those were directly or adjacent to their digital surgery platforms. So answering your question, I think we're going to see a flattening out there. I do think that you're going to see a little bit more of the downsizing going on of the people who don't want to come back to the office. And I know I'm not going to be popular on this, but I'm reporting what I hear from executives. These aren't my opinions. These are the things that over the, you know, I'd say we make 1,000 calls a week out to the market. So I'm getting real data. And these executives, while they want to give some sort of blend to life, very few of them are happy with this work from none of your business. And because that's where it's gone. It's gone from a lowered output and a higher expectation across the board. And then also what I think we're seeing, Tom, is I think we're seeing Medtronic in particular realizing what their identity should be. And you know, I have my own opinion on that and with some evidence around that if you want to talk about that. But we're the canary in the coal mine in medtech. And I will tell you, the month of April has been certainly a rise up in activity. Inbound calls, financings, acquisitions. So you just saw Distal Motion put 124 million in the bank. You're talking about Shockwave and BSC potential dance going on. Certainly you've got the Nuvasive Globus thing still going on. We've had the Abiomed close, which I think the large strategics outside of Medtronic are going to start spending money on acquisitions because it's a good deal environment and they've got the dry powder.
Lot to unpack there. Yeah. Okay. You'll find no bigger work from home advocate than myself. I've worked remotely for most of my career, but I write and I do podcasts. I get it. I get what you're saying. Is there been a genuine connection made between more remote working and less efficiency, or is this something that people are just pointing to as, well, we need to decide who's going to stay and who's going to go, and these people want to be in the office and these people don't, and it's a reason to make the cuts? Or is there evidence that you've seen or collected that indicates there is a lower efficiency?
Well, there's a lower efficiency. Forever the model has been, let's all get together and work together on fixing a product, manufacturing a product, inspecting a product, strategizing on where we're going. You've worked from anywhere a good part of your career, but to your point, you're sort of a lone wolf who is a creative. Yeah? And so that's a different personality, and your business model was designed by you. The business model in the medtech companies has been designed, has stood up, right or wrong, for nearly 100 years.
Yeah, true.
And so suddenly you take a throat punch and you say, okay, everybody stays away for rightful reasons at that point in time with what we knew.
Yep.
And then, okay, now some of you can come back. And then some of you don't want to come back, but we don't want to lose you. And this is where it starts to get dynamic. We don't want to lose you because we don't know what's going to happen on the other side of this yet. We don't know what the consequences are, the unintended consequences are of allowing a reasonably large part of our workforce working in an ecosystem that was designed for in-person. What is that going to do to the dynamic? So that's where the great experiment failed. I think if we could redesign the world of work with a remote force in mind, it would look tremendously different than today.
Yeah.
But we don't have that at hand right now because we're all running companies.
Yep.
And so I do think some of them that got redlined on that list were the people who did not want to come back. I also think out of sight, out of mind. And so that's gone on forever. And we were having this discussion recently. When you're in an expat situation, let's say you're a rock star out of a large strategic, let's say it's Baxter. And Baxter goes, you want to go OUS? And at first, people in the beginning were, cool, yeah, you got to go OUS if you want to grow. If you're out of corporate headquarters every single day, where all the decisions are being made, and you are not at the table, and you're OUS, anybody who's ever had an expat role has had a hard time coming back.
Interesting.
To get right in the mix again. They've either lost their Dutch aunt or uncle. The person that was their supporter may have left. They don't get the great jobs or the great opportunities that are hottest happening. And it's a very similar dynamic from working from none of your business.
I feel like I'm watching an episode of Survivor where they would send one person off and they would miss out on all the little negotiations that are going on.
And that's exactly what happens. That's exactly.
But you're right, because I've talked to people who have said, no, you need to go OUS. I think they said for every year you spend OUS, it's like worth 3 in the US because you just learn so much so quickly. But that seems to be an old formula in Europe.
It's an old formula, and the rate of innovation and the speed of communication these days and the things that happen in a week today versus a week 10 years ago are tremendously different.
Wow, fascinating. All right, so you put the Medtronic box. Let's move that one out there and unpack that.
Yeah.
What is your assessment of where it was, where it went, and where it needs to go?
First of all, I'm a fan of Medtronic.
Yep.
I am. Let's make that very clear. Here's what you may want to consider as you step back and look at the history of Medtronic. So let's start back in the Tyco days. So there was a little company called EV3 for those of us that was around. Bob Palmisano wrapped up 5 technologies that were reasonably good and moved them all into one company called EV3. And they were all, for the most part, pretty much IDE PMA products. Tyco came in and bought them. And at that point in time, Tyco had never had a PMA in the history of their organization.
Oh, interesting.
And so here's a company that was a commodities company for the most part, mid-tier commodities company, buys a technology company, EV3. Great. That doesn't make you a technology company if your DNA at its core is not DNA. Then it goes in and it rolls into Covidian. But it becomes Covidian because it's a tax move. It's an inversion into Ireland, right? So that inversion into Ireland upset a lot of people from a do the right thing, but it was legally tax legal. And it was made justifiably to become a more profitable organization, not around technology, right? Here's another issue you need to look at. 69 of the people currently in Medtronic today, director or above, came from GE. So I always worry about groupthink. And GE is another good company. I wouldn't say they're the best medical device company of all time, but you've had this infiltration of leadership at the C level, as well as other leaders, primarily a GE mindset-driven organization, which, if you compare them to other medical device companies, they're really good at rubbing the pennies out of the nickels, but they're not a technology company.
Interesting.
And so if you look where Medtronic's been missing it lately, they've been missing it on in their quality systems, and they've been missing it on the areas they select to go after in the super high tech, i.e. digital, robotics, massive investments, and less than optimal outcomes. So I think there's an issue there, and then you take it to the next step. It's hard to be a $32 billion a year medical device company. It's really hard unless you're spending an enormous amount of R&D money. Medtronic's spend on R&D, I think last year was $3 billion. Their gross sales was $32 billion. They're competing against an Intuitive who was $6.2 billion and spent nearly $1 billion in R&D.
Wow.
And an R&D dollar in Medtronic isn't nearly as efficient as a $1 spent on R&D in an Intuitive or a company that all they do is focus on one technology. So you took that $3 billion, $3.2 billion out of Medtronic and spread it across a number of business units with less than efficient efforts towards R&D. See where this is going?
Yep, yep.
So that's where I think that they need to realize that they're a supply chain distribution aggregator of technologies. And you're seeing J&J do this now with evidence with Biosense Webster and with Abiomed, is they're buying the company and they're harmonizing the quality systems, which they have to do because it affects the entire organization, and certainly dashboarding the financial function. But everything else is staying local. And what does that do? When you make an acquisition of a company, the acquiring company tries to retain the EVPs and the VPs of technology, right? They try and give them retention packages because they think that those are the people who are going to bring the technology over. You actually need to go 2 levels below them are the people who are doing the technology work. And when a company is acquired, that doesn't make you an expert at that technology. It allows you to put that technology in your bag. And so what happens typically is those acquisitions, if you long tail them for 24 to 36 months, the innovation is gone because all of the innovators left. They took their money and they went to another startup because you didn't have an environment that would attract them or want them to stay to keep on doing the great work they're doing. And that's where I think the Medtronic model needs to be evaluated or decide if they're just going to be a commodities company or a technology company. That's where it's happening. And then one more thing, let's keep this in mind. If you take the top 50 medical device companies, the top 10 account for about $200 billion in sales. The next 40 account for $200 billion in sales. So there's a reason why it's really hard to get to north of 20 billion in sales in a medtech company and retain a technological leadership post unless you change the structure and you become an incredibly decentralized organization while still figuring out how to leverage all those entities.
So we've talked about surgical robotics space before, and you kind of got me thinking just about J&J and Medtronic. Are companies like that, and I want to say those specific companies, are they capable of that moon launch kind of, we're going to build a surgical robotic system, or from your perspective, are they better off buying one of the companies that you referenced earlier that are emerging and coming up and maybe have benefited from the talent you spoke of who, after the big deal, they went off to start a new robotic company. And I'm going all over the place, but has that led to sort of the emergence of all these new surgical robotics companies, all the talent that's kind of dropped off from acquired properties or an Intuitive or established players?
So what's really interesting, and I feel like have got a great venue over the last 9 years in surgical robotics, especially soft tissue, orthopedic. Let's stay on soft tissue because that's where we are right now. A
Sure.
soft tissue robot you and I have discussed is entirely different than an orthopedic robot. Making it, bringing it to market, adoption, utilization. So let's say soft tissue for a second. The biggest issue with a soft tissue robotic platform is historically when you made a medical device, IDE, PMA, all your R&D money after it made it through the FDA, for the most part, drops off precipitously, about 80% of it. So if you're making a structural heart, a MitraClip, an Affera mapping, right? All that heavy lifting happened before you got through your IP, got through your safety, efficacy, got your clearance approval. Then you're like, whew, good thing we got done with that, right? Clinical drops off, R&D drops off in relative terms. When you have a soft tissue robot, when you go to market, you almost have to double and triple down on your R&D.
Wow.
Because it's almost like, think of it like a Tesla.
Yeah.
Elon Musk came out this week and said, I can sell my Teslas for cost or even take a slight loss because my real value is going to be the software on the road moving forward. And it's the same thing with a robot, soft tissue robot. So you've got to double and triple down on subject matter experts on the R&D side after you launch, in addition to all the lifting you did before. So if you buy a surgical robot, a soft tissue robot, and you don't retain that R&D team, and you think that you're going to attract best-in-class R&D people, imaging, navigation, AI, ML, UI, UX, all of that, all technologies that are not native to medical device, for the most part, and you're going to be able to perpetuate that platform against somebody who has that expertise in-house all day long, therein lies the issue, which is why I think you've got to go to shared revenue models so you can acquire a CMR. And most of the team will stay at CMR because they get to do CMR things. But if I'm a CMR person and I've got to go do J&J things, which is not a native soft tissue robot digital company, I'm not going to stay. I'm going to go find somebody else to play with in that domain that's going to grow my skill sets.
Interesting. So the additional commitment to R&D for surgical robotic systems, it's to continue to enhance the system, to develop new features, to just like every other technology device we buy, we want it to continue to grow and to emerge and to always have new features. That's a really obvious difference between traditional medical devices that I hadn't picked up on.
Yeah, and in addition to that, to get a robot through the FDA, you want to get an MVP, a minimal viable product through. So the number of features that are quote unquote embedded into the system yet to be turned on are pretty profound because that just makes it a much more complex regulatory pathway. So as you then start to get these in the clinician's hands, the surgeon's hands, the work team's hands, you learn in the OR, in the theater. That's an incredible advantage of every case you do. You're informing back to your engineers, back to your UI, UX, back to how it interacts. Building the robot itself is the easiest part. Having the software and the decision-making that occurs from the amalgamation of data and then therefore gives the insights to the clinician and the work teams has to come from the aggregation of data and then constantly, because those technologies, sensors, visualization systems continue to get better and better every year, you've got to be able to incorporate those into that product platform. And you need the engineers to do that.
Interesting. So we'll talk to Jeff Alvarez of Moon Surgical on this podcast. We're going to interview him a little later. We'll have him at Device Talks Boston. Is Moon Surgical, now that you're talking, I'm seeing, is that almost kind of a hybrid robotic device? Because it's a robotic system, but it's very targeted at what it does. From what I gather, it's not trying to be everything to all people and trying to solve all the problems. It's trying to solve the immediate problem of holding a device in place to free up someone in the OR to do something else. Is that sort of a next generation of robotic company you see, or is that kind of a one-off? Because I know you're familiar with the company. How do you see Moon Surgical fitting into the entire landscape?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Jeffrey is I think one of the brightest minds in surgical robotics. He, by the way, for those that don't know, Fred Moll, of course, everyone knows Fred if you're in robotics.
Yep.
Jeff was the first hire at Oris. So, and Fred.
Pretty good claim.
Yeah, it's a pretty good claim, right? So, and then Jeff's seen a lot of different technologies over time, right?
Yeah.
So what they went in and did very basically is put together I coined the word a couple of years ago, a here, hold this robot. And I mean that respectfully.
Yeah.
And it allows you to use your same stick. It allows you to use your own visualization system. It also has intelligence on board that's collecting all kinds of data for the surgeon. It's also a much lower price point. It gives the surgeon very similar capabilities to whether you would get with some of the other soft tissue cleared robots out there. It's in the market. And Tom, the thing that is critical to a robot is getting it to the market and getting feedback from the market. Because until you get there and all you had is your own KOL sitting in a lab with you and giving you an echo chamber of how fun this is and how great it is, it's the people who don't appear on the podium that you need to get hundreds of those hands, eyes, and styles into your robot in order to really get a robot that is going to be robust and withstand the pressure in the market. So selling your first 10 robots is tremendously easier than selling your next 90.
Interesting, interesting. Last question about robotics. I
Yeah.
want to talk about things more broadly. We talked about CMR, Renovo, others that are emerging. What does this landscape look like, you think, in a couple of years? Are we going to see some acquisitions? Are we going to see Renovo come in from Asia into the US, or CMR continue to work in the US and take share from companies? And within that question, within that answer, give me your assessment of Intuitive. We had the conversation on the podcast, Chris Newmark and I, last week. Is Intuitive's lead just too great right now? Is it? I mean, I know they don't have a significant piece of the market, but they're killing it right now. Like, they're just having quarter after quarter having really strong news and a lot of placements. And do they have an insurmountable lead in surgical robotics?
As of today, I would call it insurmountable.
Really?
Yeah, I would call it insurmountable. When you focus on one thing and one thing only, and it's not only making a robot, which is what Gary and his team have done. What they've done is they've also built an unbelievable supply chain. And they have enough misses internally in the organization to get a sense for what works and what doesn't work. At any point in time, Intuitive's got 2 or 3 different platforms being built inside. And they also, what Gary's doing right now is not necessarily gaining market share. What he's doing is strengthening market share. Mm-hmm. So his R&D spend, and it was in the public domain, his R&D spend is going into facilities, manufacturing, supply chain, reducing the number of players in his supply chain, increasing his footprint in his manufacturing facilities, putting manufacturing facilities closer to the user base. So he's doing something really intelligent by firming up and getting ready to scale in order to move to the next level of sort of sales and domination of that market. Is the market looking for second and third alternatives? It's great for the market to have second and third alternatives. You know, it's forcing the single port. It's forcing, you know, technology forward on the Intuitive platforms. But I'm not sure I would pick a fight on that format in that area right now, because the people who are going, CMR and Ascensus is the only other cleared robot in the US, who's doing something really clever at Anthony Fernando down there, and they don't get enough press, and I think they should. Anthony's doing something very, very clever right now that is not trying to compete with the Intuitive platform. What he's done is he's moved it a little bit towards precision digital surgery, not over-indexing towards the robot, right? And we can spend time on that now or another time. But to go up against Gary in a large format soft tissue robot in the US is insane. And I think that's why CMR's staying outside. They're in with the FDA right now. Whether or not that's going to be easy sailing or not, yet to be seen. I don't think it will be. And I think they're going to be really clever about what they're doing. Plus, they're also going through some major cash right now. They had a downsizing. They went from like 300 people 2 years ago to 1,100 people. And I think they just downsized by 300 or 400 people, if I get the number right. And they're being clever about it. You know, Per left. He wasn't a surgical robotics or even a medical device guy. right? They brought in a medical device person. They're saying, okay, let's pause here. Let's
What
not
was
get
the difference? Because I interviewed Per for the podcast, and
Yeah.
I was like, oh, this is great. Someone who's actually in robotics is going to be leading one of these companies. They're going to bring all the knowledge from all these other industries into medical device. And I have no idea how he did it. I don't know. After that interview, I haven't really looked at the company. So, but is it just, our medical devices just so different than everything else that skill set wasn't really as necessary as I thought it was?
a soft tissue robotic company isn't a robotic company.
Yeah.
It's a digital surgery company. And so Per, although comes out of a robotic background, is industrial robotics, which is, trying to say that selling a Maybach, is the same thing as selling a Prius. There are different markets, different users, different expectations across the board. Per also came from a very large organization. And if you look at what they did during his tenure, they said bigger is better by his guidance. And bigger isn't necessarily better at the point CMR was at. Because if you don't have major cash flow, I think they've got 100 systems out in the market right now, and I think 10,000 surgeries under their belt. They're still a baby. And so you're burning through a lot of cash there learning.
Yeah.
And so if you're not a Medtech person, you don't understand how to take that product to market, and you can still push things through in the market saying bigger is better. We need to expand, expand, expand. And I don't think bigger is better in soft tissue robotics in your first few years of existence. You can burn through a lot of cash. And now they're going to have to go out and raise another round if they're going to go commercial. They're probably sitting on the sidelines waiting for J&J to say, are we going to spend $12 billion and buy CMR? Because that's the conversations going on right now inside the J&J walls, because their robot is not going to get to market anytime soon. And so they have to make a decision. Are we going to partner with a CMR and do a rev share? Well, there's a hint of that in Europe right now.
Yep.
So we'll see what happens there. But it's still, I think, jury's still out. Medtronic can't afford to buy a robot right now, and they shouldn't buy a robot right now. They've got other challenges ahead of them.
Interesting. We'll have Martin Bueller of J&J at, not at Device Talks, at our affiliated event, which is happening at the same time, same place, the Healthcare Robotics Engineering Forum. If anyone wants to attend either of those, they can register for Device Talks and use the code TMG25. Save 25% off the price. Just want to get that little plug in there. Was that subtle?
No, it was great.
So I could, honestly, I could talk about this the entire time, but you opened up talking about Boston Scientific and Shockwave and just sort of where we are. Let's talk about where we are going forward before we hit the play button, as I usually say, with a lot of play buttons in this studio. The play buttons. You talked about let's end on a hopeful note. You're hopeful about where the sector is headed. Walk me through some of the positives you're seeing. I do love the Boston Shockwave combo. That seems like a real winner if it were to happen. But what are some other things that you're seeing out there that have you feeling optimistic?
Yeah, you're seeing financings come through. You're seeing the distal motion we talked about beforehand. Michael Frederick had that financing go through. You got the activities going on in the acquisition in the public markets. Whether or not BSC can pick up Shockwave at this juncture, we'll see. There's a lot of cash sitting around right now. And the venture and the PE money coming in too, they've got to spend that money because, you got a VC and a 10-year fund.
Yep.
Now, what's happening is the problem there is you can't get a lead a lot of times because the VCs are sitting on dry powder for their existing investments. And so if you can't get a lead, you can't get follow-up investors on there. So that's really where the sticking point is on the A rounds. But I think that, B and C rounds you're going to see in the second half of this year start to come online. I do think the public market's going to come back around. I think all of the second half of 2021, there were 18 deals done. Just in the second half of 2021. In 2022, I think there were only 6 deals done, IPOs.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So, we had that trend going down. So the public markets will be interesting to watch, but I do think the large strategics and mid caps are going to start an acquisition activity sooner than later because there are some gaps in the game going on right now. And I also think as the large strategics shed certain properties, they'll get picked up and put in the hands of people who are more adept at growing that market and serving those patients better in areas like diabetes. I think you're going to see some fallout in EP areas. I love the Afira acquisition by Medtronic. Our office, we were flat through the first 3.5 months of 2023. We're a bellwether. I do tell you, as I mentioned, April's really ramping up right now. So the industry at large is as healthy as it's been over the last 8 or 10 months. I saw this coming in August of 2022, and my organization knew that. But I didn't expect it to get as tough as it was December, January, February. And in my 32 years, it was the worst market I've ever seen.
Interesting. I mean, it seems like we're at some sort of a standoff, because you'll have some companies that'll need to raise capital, but if they do so, they're probably going to, if they raised money 2 years ago, they're probably going to have a serious valuation reset. Maybe they're waiting to raise their money until the IPO market opens up, because that'll help them with their valuations. But on the other hand, you have all these buyers who could come in now and buy at pretty good prices. So this could go in many different directions.
Well, I think the people who are worrying about their valuation at the risk of their existence are silly.
Yeah.
Right? When I used to look at the value of some properties I used to own, and my wife looks at me and she goes, it doesn't matter what they're worth until you sell them.
Yep.
So if you're in a startup right now and you're worrying about your valuation at the cost of your life versus worrying downrange when you do get there, which that's the only number that matters, candidly.
Yep.
So investors, founders, venture people need to relax on the valuations because they were inflated anyway. And the digital thing, I just want to add this, Tom. I think the whole digital frenzy was a big issue on why there's some financial headwinds still in the marketplace. The frenzy of digital was going to solve everything was a little too frothy. And you had investors who shouldn't have been in there got in. And then nobody was asking the question often enough, who's going to pay for this within the healthcare continuum? And so all of these digital solutions that had taken away a lot of investment from the analog devices have gone away. And it's a little tougher, and it should be, to get financing for certain categories of digital right now. And it's starting to become a little bit easier because the old analog devices are coming back into style. And I'll tell you, there's a great VC firm in Israel, and they're friends of mine. And we were chatting when I was out there a couple months ago, and they said, we haven't invested in an analog device in years. We've been investing in digital. We think analog is at risk or not the same returns. And I wonder if they would say that today. And I think you still have your analog investments that are we still have to do the plumbing, we still have to do the electricity, we still have to do the framing of the house, which is us. And the digital, to me, is just a nice to have 10, 15, 20 years down the road. But over the next 5 years, I don't think digital makes the impact everybody thought it would in 2019, 2018, until about 2 years ago.
Fantastic. Well, I could keep asking questions, but we've covered a lot of ground. Joe, thanks again for having me at 160 Studios. Thanks for being part of Device Talks Boston on May 10th and 11th. As I mentioned earlier, folks can use the code TMG25, save 25% off. We'll have Mike Mahoney there doing a keynote.
I know.
See what he says. I'm guessing probably not much, but he'll be there, so anything could happen. And you'll be there as well, and you and Holly Scout. Thank you for your partnership in all of this.
Always appreciate it and appreciate the time.